The med bay smelled of cold panic and ozone, a thin chemical tang that scoured the sinuses and clung to the back of the throat. The signature scent of the hegemony's particular brand of institutional care. It was a smell Kael knew intimately, a perfume woven into the fabric of his dishonorable discharge. His fall from grace. He lay on a polymer slab, the surface cool and unyielding against his back, and stared at the flickering lumen panel overhead. A hairline crack spiderwebbed across its surface, and a single fat insect, some Ganymedian variant bio, engineered for protein reclamation, was trapped between the layers of plexiglass. It buzzed in frantic, tiny circles, a prisoner in a cage of light. He understood the sentiment. The pain in his left forearm was a dull, insistent throb, a steady drumbeat of failure. It wasn't the searing agony of the initial flash burn, when the training rifle's energy cell had decided to vent its corrosive plasma not towards the designated target, but directly onto his vambrace. That had been a white-hot scream of nerve, endings instantly cauterized. This was the aftermath, a deep, resonant ache that pulsed in time with the station's life support. The armor had held, mostly. The cheap, recycled alloy had slagged, bubbling, and warping into a blackened ruin. But it had absorbed enough of the discharge to save the limb, mostly. A section the size of his palm had burned through the synth fabric of his undersuit, kissing the skin beneath with incandescent fury. He flexed his fingers, watching them curl and uncurl. They obeyed. Good. A useless limb was a one-way ticket to the protein vats. The hegemony wasted nothing, especially not the organic components of its recycled soldiers. He was a resource, a unit of potential violence, and the medbay was just another station on the assembly line, retooling damaged parts for another tour on the factory floor of war. The sound of boots on the grated deck plating pulled him from his reverie. They were soft-soled, not the heavy, magnetic stomp of an enforcer or the deliberate tread of a line officer. These were the quiet, efficient steps of someone who spent their days navigating tight spaces filled with broken bodies. A woman appeared in his peripheral vision, her form backlit by the corridor's harsh lighting. She moved without ceremony, pulling a mobile diagnostic unit behind her that whined with the protest of unoiled wheels. She didn't look at his face. Her attention was fixed on the burn. Her hands were already moving, gloved in a thin, translucent membrane as she peeled back the scorched fabric of his undersuit. A fresh wave of the ozone smell washed over him, sharper this time, mixed with the acrid scent of his own cooked flesh. Faulty power cell, he grunted, more to fill the silence than to offer an explanation. Standard issue. The medic didn't respond. Her focus was absolute. She was younger than he'd expected, though the perpetual exhaustion etched around her eyes made it hard to be certain. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe functional knot, and her face was a mask of detached professionalism. But there was something in the hard set of her jaw, a tension in the lines of her mouth, that spoke of a deep and abiding anger. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror. It was the face of someone who had been pushed past their limit and had decided to make a permanent home there. She sprayed a numbing agent onto the wound. It was brutally cold, a shock of ice against the deep heat of the burn, and the throbbing in his arm subsided into a distant, tingling numbness. He could feel the pressure of her fingers as she debrided the wound, scraping away the blackened skin and fused fabric with a metallic tool. But the pain was gone, replaced by a phantom sensation, a ghost of an agony that his brain insisted should be there. "You're lucky," she said, her voice flat, devoid of sympathy. It was a simple statement of fact. The plasma cauterized the wound as it burned, cleaner than a clean room laser. Less chance of infection. "The hegemony's shoddy engineering saves the day," Cal replied. His voice thick with a cynicism so ingrained it felt like a part of his own biology. "I'll be sure to file a commendation." For the first time, she looked up. Her eyes meeting his, they were a startlingly clear shade of gray, like a storm-swept sea. And they held his gaze with an unnerving intensity. There was no flicker of amusement, no shared moment of gallows humor. Just a cool, appraising stare. She saw the recycled insignia on his collar, the faint outline of where an officer's rank had once been stitched onto his fatigues. She saw the bitterness in him, the weariness. He could feel her cataloging him, diagnosing him not as a patient, but as a symptom of the disease that afflicted them all. "They don't care if it works," she said, her voice dropping to a low, clipped tone. "Only that it's cheap. Cheaper to burn out a few recycled grunts than to manufacture reliable energy cells. The calculus is simple." She turned her attention back to his arm, applying a bio-scaffold patch. The gel-like substance adhered to his raw flesh, and he felt a strange, cellular knitting sensation as the nanomites within began their work, stitching his tissues back together on a microscopic level. It was advanced technology, a miracle of biointegration that was grotesquely at odds with the faulty rifle that had caused the injury in the first place. Another hegemony contradiction, the brilliant, life-saving cure for the disease it deliberately propagated. "You sound like you've run the numbers," he observed. "I was a biosystems analyst," she said, her voice tight. She smoothed the edges of the patch, her touch precise and impersonal. "I ran the numbers on everything. Resource allocation, mortality projections, acceptable casualty thresholds." She paused, her hands hovering over his arm for a fraction of a second too long. "Turns out the hegemony doesn't appreciate it when you run the numbers on unauthorized distribution of medical supplies to uncycle sectors." There it was. The idealism, the fatal flaw. Kael felt a familiar, weary disappointment settle in his gut. He had her pegged now. One of the believers. One of the ones who thought they could fix a fundamentally broken system with small acts of futile defiance. They were always the first to be crushed. "So you traded a clean lab coat for a bloody smock," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Trying to save the unsalvageable. That's not a sound resource allocation strategy, medic." Her hands stopped. She slowly raised her head and the cold professionalism in her gray eyes was replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered fire. "My name is Sloane," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "and the people I was helping weren't unsalvageable. They were children with nutrient deficiencies, elders with respiratory failure from breathing recycled air for a century. They were human beings the hegemony had designated as obsolete parts. They were a drain on the system," Kael countered, the old pragmatic officer in him taking over. It was an argument he'd had with himself 1,000 times in the dead of night. The cold logic of command, warring with the ghost of his conscience. A system that's already strained to the breaking point. You divert resources, you create a weakness. A weakness the enemy exploits. The calculus is simple. He threw her own words back at her. Sloane let out a short, sharp breath that wasn't a laugh. It was a sound of pure contempt. The enemy. You still believe that propaganda? You think some chitinous bug on a rock 12 light years away is the real enemy? She leaned closer, her voice a fierce whisper. The enemy is the system that tells you it's better to let a child die than to divert a single gram of sterile saline from a soldier who's going to be used as bullet fodder anyway. The enemy is the one who does that math and calls it efficiency. Her proximity was unnerving. He could smell the faint, clean scent of antiseptic on her skin, see the tiny flecks of a darker gray in her irises. She was right, of course. On a fundamental human level, she was absolutely, unequivocally right. And that's what made her so dangerous. That kind of thinking was a disease in a place like this. Hope was a pathogen. It weakened the host, made them vulnerable. He'd learned that lesson in the blood and vacuum of a failed operation that had cost him everything. Sentiment is a weapon your enemy gives you to use against yourself, he said, his voice low and gravelly. It's a luxury, one we can't afford here. Your idealism got you recycled. It'll get you killed next time. And your pragmatism, she shot back, her voice dripping with scorn. What did that get you? A spot on the same assembly line, right next to me. The only difference is, you've convinced yourself the machine is right to be grinding you into dust. I, at least, know what I'm fighting for. Fighting? You think you're fighting? He almost laughed. You're surviving. Barely. Same as the rest of us. Don't dress it up as something noble. We are cogs, Sloane. Nothing more. We turn until our teeth wear down, and then we're replaced. He had pushed her too far. He saw it in the way her jaw tightened, the way the muscles in her neck stood out. She finished wrapping his arm with a compression bandage, her movements sharp and angry. She pulled the final strap, so tight, it made him wince. There, she said, stepping back. The scaffold will dissolve in 12 hours. The skin underneath will be good as new, ready to be burned off again. Before he could retort, another figure was guided into the medbay by a bored-looking MP. It was a kid, no older than 18, though his eyes held the vacant, 1,000-yard stare of a man 3 times that age. He was rail-thin, swimming in his fatigues, and his skin was a pale, almost translucent gray, as if he hadn't seen a real sun in his entire life. A constant, fine tremor ran through him, a vibration that seemed to originate from deep within his bones. He moved with a shuffling, uncertain gait, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. The MP grunted. Psych eval. He had another episode during the tactical sims. Sloane's entire demeanor shifted. The fire in her eyes banked, replaced by a guarded, almost protective weariness. She looked at the boy, and the hard lines of her face softened with a pained empathy that was so profound it made Kael's chest ache. "Jax," she said softly. The name was a gentle question. The boy, Jax, didn't seem to hear her. He allowed the MP to guide him to a cot in the far corner of the bay, where he sat down. His back ramrod straight, his hands placed perfectly flat on his knees. He stared at the blank wall opposite him, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was a profound and unsettling stillness about him, a stark contrast to the tremors that racked his thin frame. He was like a ghost haunting the edges of the room, a silent specter of trauma. Kael watched the exchange, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He'd seen shell-shocked soldiers before. He'd seen men broken by the horrors of combat. This was different. This wasn't the result of a battle fought. This was the quiet, terrifying hum of a battle being waged eternally inside the kid's own skull. He was another piece of faulty equipment, another soul, fed into the Ganymede grinders. "What's wrong with him?" Kael asked, his voice quieter than before. Sloane was already moving towards Jax, her earlier anger at Kael seemingly forgotten, subsumed by a more immediate concern. She didn't look back at Kyle as she answered. "The hegemony calls it combat-induced sensory disassociation," she said, the clinical term sounding like a profanity on her lips. "They say the stress of training is causing a psychotic break. They give him neurodampeners, run their useless scans, and then they send him back out." She stopped beside Jax's cot, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. The boy flinched, a violent full-body shudder, but he didn't pull away. He just continued to stare at the wall, a single tear tracing a path down his dust-caked cheek. "He's not broken," Sloane whispered, more to herself than to Kael. "He's just listening to something no one else can hear." Kael pushed himself into a sitting position on the edge of the slab. The medbay suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, charged with an unspoken tension. He looked from the medic, with her fierce doomed compassion, to the ghost-like boy in the corner, vibrating with some unseen energy. He had come here expecting a simple patch job, a mechanical repair. Instead, he had found 2 people who complicated the simple, brutal arithmetic of his survival. Sloane was a fool, fighting a war she couldn't win, armed with nothing but a moral compass in a universe that had no true north. And the boy, The boy was a casualty before he'd even seen a battlefield. They were both liabilities. Weak links. The pragmatic officer in him screamed to walk away, to maintain the detachment that had kept him alive this long. Don't get involved. Don't form attachments. Don't let their lost causes become his. But as he slid off the cot, the recycled air of the medbay filling his lungs, he couldn't shake the image of Sloane's hand on Jax's shoulder. It was a gesture of profound, reckless humanity in a place designed to stamp it out. It was the kind of gesture he had once believed in, before the pressure and the failure had crushed it out of him. He looked at his newly repaired arm, the skin beneath the bandage a pristine, unblemished canvas, ready for the next scar. The hegemony could patch the flesh, but Kael knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that some wounds went too deep to ever truly heal. He was looking at two of them. And, to his profound dismay, he felt the ghost of an old familiar instinct stir within him. The instinct to protect his own. It was an instinct that had ruined him once. He had a sinking feeling it was about to do so again.